Hello there, so without a doubt, you've played or at least seen maps like this one before. High intensity, high slider velocity, unusual rhythm, and a whole lot of fancy sliders mapped to music featuring tons of weird wub noises and irregular rhythms. These maps, along with their respective types of songs, can be found everywhere now, and new players might be growing up with the understanding that they've been around forever given their widespread frequency of creation. Surprisingly though, these maps have only been reaching the ranked category for about 2 years so far. Before then, they were practically non-existent, even among unranked maps. So, what is it that led these wub songs and their distinct style of map to the mainstream of mapping, and how has that affected the mapping scene? Come on, wub maps? Really? Yeah, let's get that out of the way first. I don't know anything about the limitless genres and subgenres of music. Wub, despite sounding silly, is the most universally understood word encapsulating the types of songs I want to talk about, like the obvious dubstep, but more notably genres like drumstep, a high-tempo combination of dubstep and drum and bass, and neurofunk, a drum and bass experimental offshoot. Again though, I'm not even close to a genre aficionado. All I know is what parts of these genres have spread to Osu, and their shared impact on mapping, which initially began thanks to the work of one mapper, Skystar. That isn't to say he was the first person to map drumstep or neurofunk. Those genres have been around for a while, and a few other mappers have messed around with these songs before him. The specific way Skystar mapped these songs, however, was what helped spark their growth in popularity among mappers. His map of Function Phantom's Neuronesia, ranked at the end of 2014, was one of the first of these to gain extensive recognition. A drumstep song featuring sections of aggressive wubs and unorthodox emphasis of drum sounds, mapped in an equally unorthodox fashion for the time with dense rhythm, fast slider speeds, and high usage of slider leniency. To start with, rhythm choice on this map is relatively liberal compared to other maps, especially with its usage of 1/4 sliders. Expressing one sound on their heads and another on their tails is a normal way to handle these, but on Neuronesia, 1/4 sliders rarely do that. Instead, they're mostly used to form a sort of contrast between clicking percussion and wub noises. If you're paying attention, it should be clear what's going on here. The first sound, a bass kick, is mapped with a circle, while the second, a wub noise, is expressed by a 1/4 slider. Drums are sounds with sharp impacts, so it makes perfect sense to map them with individual circles. There's no holding of a keyboard key involved, unlike what's intended with these wubs. In the song, these notes are held until the next percussion sound cuts them off, so it's fairly appropriate to map them with a held slider. This causes players to react with movement and clicking differently than they would with a circle, while also visually showing what different sounds are being represented. The following objects then go by the same concept. Snare drum here is a circle, long wub sound is a big slider, circle for drum, slider for wub, drum, etc. Even though all these 1/4 sliders don't actually map a sound with their tails, they fit the music effectively, representing the difference in impacts between drums and wubs. Like, if all 1/4 sliders were replaced by circles, as would be found in a more conventional map, there just wouldn't be enough contrast in design to express the song's massive instrumental variations. Speaking of variations, this map isn't quite as strict with consistency as something like Rootus's map a few weeks ago. Being consistent mapping-wise with every repeated sound logically makes the most sense, but it might not express the song's perceived unnatural changes in pitch and unnatural points of emphasis very well, which could be why Skystar chose to implement a few forms of variety. Instead of copying and pasting sliders to express the same long wub sounds, each has its own unique shape sharing similar characteristics. Instead of cleanly spacing apart all objects, some overlaps are used which complement the map's visual style. And instead of repeating the exact same rhythms, rhythm is mixed up to always keep players on edge, without contradicting the important parts of the song. This level of inconsistency still follows the music well enough, but also leads to a persistent feeling of uneasiness for players during gameplay, which is even further intensified by the high rhythm density, high slider velocity, and high reliance on slider leniency. Personally, I think all of that is the appeal of Neuronesia. What's the point of creating chaos like this? To make every moment of the map engaging. With unpredictability comes intrigue. Nothing is stale when every slider design, object arrangement, and rhythm is, in some way, new, and it fits perfectly when paired with a genre of music supporting such chaos with its unorthodox composition. Of course, some level of uniformity is required when mapping, which Skystar balances with his careful usage of variety well enough to create this top-tier map. Maybe it isn't by today's standards, but Neuronesia was definitely special to players and mappers upon reaching rank. Every part of it was an engaging experience, both on the small scale when comparing patterns in the map, and on a large scale when comparing it to other known maps at the time. Was it what led to the crazy amount of wub maps we see today though? A little bit perhaps, by warming mappers up to its outlandish ideas, but Tsuka had kinda done that already, so overall, not really. What I think more so led to the proliferation of wub maps though, was another of Skystar's maps, his rendition of Camelia's Dreamless Wanderer, created at the start of 2015. Neuronesia's wub sounds and minor rhythm irregularities are nothing compared to those found in Dreamless Wanderer. This drum step song prioritizes blue ticks over white ticks and red ticks everywhere, something 99% of songs would never do even once, while also being accompanied by tons of different wub, whoosh, and other obscure electronic noises, providing Skystar a perfect platform to show off his mapping ideas. Dreamless Wanderer took Neuronesia's general appeal, making every moment an engaging experience through high speed, slider-heavy rhythm, and unexpected design choices, then took it to the next level. Rhythmically, the map is much more dense with a bigger focus on slider usage because sliders have more room for creative manipulation than circles. With that also came the implementation of highly variable slider velocity beyond the norms of ordinary maps. SV changes are placed on every few objects, ensuring constant attention of players as they try to interpret and maneuver through the limitless forms of slider design the map has to offer. There's never a dull moment in Dreamless Wanderer, aside from the parts which are intentionally dull to express calmness of the song. That isn't to say all these different slider speed changes and visual designs are random though. They actually have some pretty clear intentions behind them, which don't at all detract from the map's appeal of being something new at all times. Like, this section is pretty basic. SV is used to express the intensity of individual sounds. This first slider is fast due to the loud wub sound. The second is slow due to the calm piano. The next two are fast for more wubs. The next is relatively slow because it lacks any intense sounds, and so on. This seems like common sense to mappers now, but the SV concept here was rarely used this frequently in older maps, partially due to the higher rhythm density modern maps have grown to utilize. This was the one which really made it popular. The same idea is used in this section, along with another concept involving contrast to heavily emphasize major downbeats. Before each big white tick is a low slider velocity, which when contrasted with the high speed on the musically strong downbeat, makes for an appropriate representation of the song. And as you can imagine, the rest of the map uses understandable changes like this as well. They're not exactly the same, but I can apply similar logic regarding contrast and prioritizing important sounds. This differentiation in SV is important for representing sounds in the music, but also for strengthening that previously mentioned appeal. What could keep a player more on edge than major variations in slider velocity, which may not be clearly readable on sight, right? You have to pay close attention to really catch what's going on, and that's the point here. Similarly, there appears to be little cohesion when it comes to slider design because no two fancy sliders form the same shape, but that's only on the surface. Sliders are arranged on the playfield using a consistent visual spacing between each of them, like almost every object is connected to one another by a distance of about this much, an aesthetic technique that's become a staple in modern mapping. And also, intensities of sounds are differentiated by the most powerful ones receiving more unusual slider shapes, while the less powerful ones are handled with more conventional curves and straight lines. Precisely managing all of these concepts while simultaneously presenting limitless creative object arrangements made for a map that the vast majority of dedicated players and mappers praised to no end. Nowadays, it may not appear to be so innovative, but being essentially the first of its kind, Dreamless Wanderer was definitely special. And here is where it began. Tons of mappers wanted to give this new mapping style a try for a few reasons. The stigma towards simplistic maps which reward easy performance points was growing, and this type of mapping was essentially its opposite. These maps gave little reward relative to their difficulty, but were still engaging enough for players to find worth their time, motivating mappers to create them. Plus, mappers were, well, growing tired of mapping the same sorts of boring songs. Nearly every piece of music supports only basic emphasis on white and red ticks, with occasional streams and no opportunity for interesting slider design. Songs with a bunch of variations and wub noises, however, like drumstep and neurofunk, gave way to exactly what mappers could use to expand their horizons. New rhythms to experiment with, and enough musical freedom to try out any kinds of out there visual designs or weird movement ideas. And most importantly, Dreamless Wanderer gave mappers a base from which to build off of. It showed exactly how a constantly engaging map could be executed, and inspired mappers to produce something in the same vein. Ever wonder why Camellia is such a popular artist among Osu mappers? Partially because he's famous for other rhythm games, but also because of Skystar's map for his song Dreamless Wanderer. Camellia's music is the essence of what best supports mapping like this because of its expansive range of variable intensity sounds and unconventional rhythms. The release of Camellia's Planet Shaper album a few weeks after Dreamless Wanderer reached rank was practically an event for the mapping community. In the few days following its release, loads of highly skilled mappers took his new music and mapped it with clear inspiration from Skystar. Like, we got a huge collab from 11 different mappers for the album's title track, 4 different renditions of the track most reminiscent of Dreamless Wanderer, and at least one map of almost every other track, all within only a week of the album's publication. These weren't just poor attempts at mapping in a new popular fashion either, they were legitimately some of the coolest maps I had ever played, taking their own unique approaches towards making a map using concepts from Dreamless Wanderer. For the most intense, wub-filled sections of each song, they kept up the same core appeal of being engaging around every corner, just in their own individual ways. This was a new era of mapping, and it only continued pushing the limits with some of the more out there neuropunk songs like Amber's Love. I've heard some people claim this is barely even music. It's a bunch of dense wub noises played with hardly predictable rhythm and highly varying levels of intensity. That's not a problem, that perfectly supports what these mappers were going for. People like Byfar took Skystar's idea of constant intrigue and pushed it to its furthest boundaries, which took shape most clearly in the highly popular collab map for Belane's song Boogie. The popularization of these electronic music subgenres among mappers is also what ultimately gave rise to the phrase technical mapping. While it has no strict definition, technical mapping is what players often use to describe maps made with the same sort of ideas as modern wub maps. Anything with obscure slider design, extreme slider variation, and less than conventional rhythm choice. The phrase only started appearing around 2 years ago, then expanded in usage up through today, where it's become just another word in the average Osu player's vocabulary. Why does it exist? So players can classify the types of maps which started appearing everywhere after Dreamless Wanderer, which not coincidentally was ranked about 2 years ago as well. By this point, it's clear that wub maps are in the mainstream. A good deal of mappers now go out of their way to find drumstep, neurofunk, and any other songs of similar genres that can make for inherently interesting maps. For players, this music makes for stimulating content, and for mappers, these songs are actually fun to map. Wub songs have essentially given form to a new, widespread style of mapping, almost all of which can be traced back to Skystar's groundbreaking interpretations of songs like Neuronesia, and more importantly, Dreamless Wanderer. While maps of this music have changed the way everyone on Osu views mapping, I still want to make it clear that this isn't the end game. Just because songs of these genres have more opportunity for variation or cool object arrangements than others, doesn't mean they're always going to make the most interesting maps. A solid mapper can make an interesting map out of any plain song, while at the same time, an uninspired mapper can make a boring map out of even the most interesting, wub-filled, variety-driven piece of music. Maybe that's just my opinion though. Anyway, thanks to these guys for supporting this video, and I'll see you next week.